Hi folks, Mark Allen here for BH Spring Solutions, and today we're going to attempt to take on one of the most controversial subjects in handguns, and that being the subject of the magazine disconnect. This device is also sometimes called the magazine disconnector, the magazine safety, the magazine disconnect safety. For our purposes today, we'll call it the magazine disconnect. And the magazine disconnect simply is this, as I'm going to demonstrate to you. By the way, every firearm you're seeing today has been multiple times now confirmed empty, and we have no accessible ammunition in the room. And the magazine disconnect device simply is this. When the magazine is removed from the pistol, the trigger is no longer enabled. It has been disconnected from the sequence of events inside the pistol that have to happen in order to fire the weapon. Then when the magazine is inserted, then the trigger is then again enabled. That is what a magazine disconnect functionally does. Now, to give you an idea of why this subject is so controversial, it is a subject that even the most prominent and very safety forward manufacturers and companies in the firearms industry still today do not know how to look at this particular device. Pro, con, good, bad, yes, no. It is so controversial that even companies under the same umbrella, as you're going to see, can't seem to agree on the virtues of having it or not having it in a handgun. Going to give you here just a quick example. The FNX45, it's one of the more modern and newer law enforcement, military, and civilian sidearms, and does not have a magazine disconnect. A 2011 release from Browning, who, by the way, is part of the same company as FN. They were late coming to market with the 1911-22 because it was sent back to the designers for the addition of a magazine disconnect. Browning has a reputation of really embracing the device, the high-power pistol, which we're going to be talking even more in depth about. Comes and has always come with every manufacturer that's produced a high power, has come with a magazine disconnect device, even though the handgun is perfectly usable without the magazine disconnect device being installed. John Browning's original 1911 and all the 1911s I know of today do not have a magazine disconnect device. The Glock pistol, this is really the one that brought this whole conversation about the magazine disconnect full circle, and I'm going to explain. BH Spring Solutions has a drop-in manual safety for the Glock pistol, and when we were demonstrating this to a law enforcement agency, the armorer, who has decades on the street himself before becoming an armorer, mentioned to us one day, completely unprompted, because we were talking about the drop-in manual safety device for the Glock pistol, and he mentioned completely unprompted, he said, you know, one of the things that concerns me about the Glock pistol is it does not have a magazine disconnect. And you've got this one line of thinking that says, you know, even if I have dropped my magazine and I'm making a magazine change and I have one in the pistol, if I need to fire that round, I want to be able to fire that round. If you do defensive drills that include magazine changes before you're empty and needing to stay on point, and sometimes fire that round in the chamber, if you train to do that, then certainly you don't want a pistol with a magazine disconnect. But this armorer related to us that he personally knows more than one officer who is breathing today, because in one of those fight for your life situations, they had Smith & Wesson, either 39 or 59 models, that had a magazine disconnect device, and just before they lost control of their handgun, they were able to hit the magazine release and dropped the magazine, and when the firearm was pointed at them, it did not work and it did not fire. That brought the whole conversation full circle, because that changes things. Anytime a device is credited with saving lives, then it takes on a little bit more of an elevated point in the conversation. So that was an eyebrow raiser for us, because prior to that, the whole conversation about the magazine disconnect was for different reasons. It was for, the integrity of the trigger pull, and I want to be able to use that round that's in the chamber if I'm making a magazine change. Fair enough, that's reasonable too. Another .380 pocket pistol we have here. This is a Browning 1955 model. It was previously the FN 1910 model. Does have a magazine disconnect device in it. Again, Browning really likes the magazine disconnect. And there is a legitimate argument, as I've just pointed out, for a magazine disconnect. And then I've got a Ruger LCP here. This is a newer, more modern pistol than some that we're looking at. In the literature that's included with this Ruger LCP, they point out the fact that this pistol does not have a magazine disconnect is a safety feature, because it allows you to load one round in the chamber for a new shooter being trained and not have the magazine in the pistol, making it impossible for that new shooter to ever fire more than one round. Okay, there's a rationale there too. And so the question becomes, who's right? Well, in the instance of, for example, FN and their modern pistols today, the FNS, the FNX series, all of these pistols do not have magazine disconnects in them. I think virtually all of Browning's pistols do have magazine disconnects in them. These are two companies under the same umbrella who take opposite positions on this very subject. So, in short, the position that we now take with our customers who contact us, because a lot of them are high power owners contacting us about their high power pistol, we get this question now multiple times a week. Well, what do you think about this magazine disconnect? What's your position about the magazine disconnect? And I'm going to share with you kind of where we've come full circle, and some research and some statistics that were involved in a book that I wrote and finished towards the end of 2017 called Get Your Defensive Firearms House in Order. Some statistics came to our consciousness, and we look at this whole equation a little bit differently today. I have multiple high powers, and some of them are defensive carry pistols. Some of them are what you call a safe queen, and target or just enjoyment guns, but not something that are in a defensive role. Today, I look at this whole question a little differently. And as an example, I've got high powers that I only use for out here in the backyard, punching holes in paper. And they're not carried, and they're not kept, at arm's length for home defense. Those don't have a magazine disconnect in them. It doesn't serve any purpose, and I don't perform any drills with them that involve mag changes. So that's one side of things. And then I have, for example, this is my probably 90% of the time carry high power, and it does have the magazine disconnect in it. And I'm going to tell you why I came up with that conclusion and to have it in the pistol. It is profoundly more likely that if I am ever the victim of a violent attack that I have to defend, it is multiple times more probable of me losing control of this handgun in a physical struggle than it is that I'm going to need to perform a magazine change with a round still left in the barrel. A violent attack, the need to stop an attack by actively defending, implies the high potential for a physical struggle. And in a physical struggle situation, the ability to drop that magazine if you know you're losing control of what you have in your hand, because you can't overcome the force of whatever is being applied to you. Okay, the ability to drop that magazine and get it out of there could potentially save your life. So now that brings us again full circle about to, what if I'm carrying a 1911? If I'm carrying a 1911, I don't have that in the picture because this handgun does not have a magazine disconnect. Does that keep me from carrying this 1911? No, it actually doesn't. But again, if I have a preference, if I have the option, such as with the high power, do I have the magazine disconnect in or do I have it out on a defensive weapon? My answer for me is I have it in. And part of the reason is because BH Spring Solutions developed a system of optimization points in the high power that does virtually eliminate the negative impact on the trigger pull that the magazine disconnect has. So that's maybe a little more in-depth look about the magazine disconnect device. And depending on your use of your particular handgun or your particular high power, you can take this information, and we do not even try to contend that there is one right answer for this, because it can be very situational. It depends on, is this a range gun for fun? Is this a defensive weapon, a home defense weapon, a carry weapon, or a competition weapon, or just a collectible piece? The answers about whether or not the magazine disconnect device is in your high power or not largely depends on what role that high power is being used in. That's what makes the most sense. Now we're going to show you some details about the magazine disconnect device in the high power pistol specifically. All right, we're going to take a little closer look at the magazine disconnect device on the high power pistol. We've got three high powers here. Here's an FN stamped high power. This is an Arcus 94, also a high power clone, and then we've got a Browning and or FN Browning high power here. And these are probably the best illustration. You will actually be able to hear some differences when these triggers are being pulled. And the first one is here. You'll listen. You can hear this scrubby sound. That scrubby sound is, this is a trigger assembly from inside a high power. This is the magazine disconnect device, and it's right here. It is on the end of a spring, and you can see it moving back and forth. When a magazine is installed, what happens is this relationship between the magazine and that magazine disconnect. When the trigger is pulled, in essence, what you're hearing as a scrubbing sound is this relationship right here. Is two pieces of metal rubbing against each other, and it's common to see this kind of a shined up area on a magazine of a high power because that's where that device is engaging the magazine. So now we got the magazine in, the trigger is again enabled, but you can imagine the effect on the feel of the trigger pull of that metal rubbing against metal. Now, here is an Arcus 94, and we'll take a listen to this. You don't hear any of that scrubbiness. That trigger inside of this Arcus is more like this trigger, and it does not have a magazine disconnect device installed. And then here's the last one. you hear just barely. Nothing like this. Kind of sounds like sandpaper, but just very, very subtle. This magazine disconnect has been optimized, and its impact on the feel of the trigger, on the performance of the trigger pull, is really, really minimal. And many high power guys, when they first feel this particular trigger pull, they think the magazine disconnect has been removed, but actually it's been BH optimized, we call it. So I'm going to take this a little bit farther, and we wanted to show you kind of the mechanics of the magazine disconnect. To show you how this relationship is, you're going to see it right there is the magazine disconnect, and then you'll see the magazine itself comes up and engages and pushes forward that device. And we can take a look right here. This explains how the magazine disconnect device works. This pistol frame has the magazine disconnect device installed. There is no magazine in, and you see the positioning of this little lever right here. It is forward in that channel. And then when we put the magazine in, watch what happens right here to that trigger lever in that channel. Is it now is forced rearward at the point of insertion of the magazine, and when the trigger is pulled, it stays rearward. When the magazine is out, it is forward, and it stays forward if the trigger is pulled. The reason that this disables the trigger is because the impact point on the sear lever is that little mark of silver right there. That's where that trigger lever is pressing against the sear lever. Just like that's where it hits, and when this trigger lever is forward in its channel, it misses. It comes and it goes harmlessly right ahead of the sear lever there. That's the reason that it works, and it's effective in stopping the or disabling the trigger. When this device is removed, the impact is that that trigger lever is rearward in its slot full time, and it just stays right there. No matter if a magazine is installed, it's in the rear, and then when the magazine is taken out, it is still in the rear of the channel there. So this particular high power, if the magazine is removed, it will still function, the trigger will still be enabled, and it will still fire. One thing that you can consider, there is a line of thinking about this magazine disconnect because the manufacturer for decades applied the word safety to it. One school of thought is, if I ever had to use my high power in a defensive shooting and people started looking closely at my weapon, if it was found that a safety had been removed from the pistol, or there was a safety missing from the pistol, that could not look good for a person who had to use a handgun defensively. And we really don't know how that would turn out, but it probably would be something that you really wouldn't need in the picture. This particular trigger that we have available at bhspringsolutions.com is a wide combat trigger, and it has no provision for a magazine disconnect in it at all. So this would be one answer. With this trigger installed, you do have better trigger control because of more surface area for your finger, but also there's not a missing magazine disconnect because there's no place to put one. Finally, every BH Spring Solutions spring kit comes with particular optimized springs that, if you choose to continue using and installing the magazine disconnect in your high power, as I have in my primary. There's some important things that you can do that will help the situation and really minimize the impact, like in this particular pistol. And you can hear there's just the faintest amount of any kind of what you can hear is metal rubbing against metal, and there's virtually no feel to it. What we have changed about this pistol, and this one that feels really loud and scrubby, this is an unaltered stock high power, and this one has been optimized, particularly the spring that is on the end of or on the back of the trigger assembly. The spring that is inside of this device, we optimized that in order to minimize the pressure of the device against the magazine. That is one help to minimizing the impact of the negative impact of the magazine disconnect device. Another thing we did was, you remember that trigger lever contacts this sear lever. All Mark III high powers from FN Browning have an additional spring right here that no other high powers have, other than the FM Argentine FM95 series. Also have this one, this spring under the sear lever. We optimized that spring because that's just a spring that your trigger must overcome in order to fire the high power. We also optimized this spring. That is a big help. You can also find polishing kits at BH Spring Solutions. One of the big helps for the magazine disconnect is if you polish the face of this magazine disconnect to a mirror-like finish, and then you polish this surface area of the magazine here. If it has any roughness to it whatsoever, polishing it will not hurt. But what you will wind up getting is just a very minimal impact of that magazine disconnect, and that's really preferable and really what we want. So hopefully this has been helpful to you and you understand the magazine disconnect controversy just a little bit better.